All right. So thank you all for coming back. That's a good sign so far. As I promised, the second half is going to be about the design of affirmative action mechanisms. And even more, sort of as promised, the second half is going to be looking a lot more like sort of one vertical. You know, this is like a sub-subfield or maybe even a sub-sub-subfield in market design research. I'm going to try and show you a vertical, which is a space that you guys could imagine working in. Like sort of tons of work is being done on this and the surrounding questions right now. OK, so here's the overview. We just did how to think about balancing fairness, efficiency, and incentives. Now I'm going to take you through sort of 3 different cuts of affirmative action and matching. So the first is going to be quota-based mechanisms. This is a very classical way of handling affirmative action that matching theory is actually going to show us doesn't work so well. But a better solution, a very clever paper of Hafelier, Yenmez, and Yildirim, is going to show us that a very similar but slightly tweaked strategy called minority reserves actually is quite effective relative to quotas. And then at the end, I'll talk about some of my, I guess, current research, joint work with Tayfun Sunmez and Umit Dur and Parag Pathak, about matching with slot-specific priorities, which sort of generalizes both of these and gives you a fully flexible framework that lets you talk not just about, you know, say, reserving quota slots for minorities, but also for athletes and, you know, the mayor's son and so forth. All right. So just a quick reminder, what are we doing here? So again, we're going to be in the world of school choice. So let's load back the same model in our heads, and I'm going to sequentially modify it to account for affirmative action. K-12 public school seats. Students are potentially strategic agents, and again, the schools have these exogenously given priorities over students. And we're going to make the priority structures more complicated pretty soon. That's that's how we're going to do something with affirmative action. Here's the old model. So just, again, quick notational review. As promised, I'm going to review notation when we need to use it. So pretty soon, we're going to be using notation for something. Set of students, set of schools. Students are still going to have linear preferences over schools. Schools are still going to have these priorities, but we're going to start playing with priorities and capacities. So this is the old model. We're going to modify this soon. And remember, again, we have to respect the quota or the capacities when we define a match. We had these old design goals. We sort of saw that you can't quite get all of them at once. Stability, strategy, proofness, and Pareto efficiency are all in conflict. But now, under the platform of these design goals, and again, particularly in the stability space, we're going to be talking about how we can add in forms of affirmative action. Good. Already pumped? Stretch? You guys all took a break, got some coffee. Now it's time to use matching theory to think about affirmative action. Ready? QED. All right. First, quota-based mechanisms. What's the story? Last time the backdrop was an impossibility theorem. This time the backdrop is going to be a policy debate. So now we're doing like real-world practical market design. Affirmative action policies, what are they? They are intended to promote access for the traditionally underrepresented through heightened outreach and efforts at inclusion. So this is the American Association for Affirmative Action, whom I'm willing to trust for a definition. Are we comfortable with the definition on the board? Nods? Good. OK. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says that affirmative action means positive steps taken to increase the representation of women and minorities in employment, education, and business from which they've historically been excluded. So that's the same, traditionally underrepresented. And they point out that affirmative action, in fact, generates intense controversy. So when you're giving some groups a leg up, you're hurting somebody else. There's a recent Supreme Court case on this, which unfortunately I'm not going to quote from because I couldn't, or a decision, I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find anything I was comfortable putting on the board as a demonstration of sort of exactly the right way to think about this controversy. So instead, I'm going to quote James Webb and Ron Paul. So Webb says, 40 years ago, the civil rights movement, after a full generation, a plethora of government-enforced diversity policies have marginalized many white workers. And Ron Paul tells us that the Civil Rights Act gave the federal government unprecedented power over hiring, employee relations, and customer service practices of every business in the country. The result was a massive violation of the rights of private property and contract, which are the bedrocks of free society. So some people, some very important people, very opinionated important people, are really up in arms about this affirmative action stuff. Okay, so intense controversy. Good. But now let's think like economists, and more specifically like market designers. There's very little disagreement about what it is that affirmative action is actually doing. Right? So there's huge amounts of disagreement about whether this is a good idea, or whether it's hurting people, or whether it's, some people think it's hurting both, the losers and the intended beneficiaries. Like, tons of debate in the policy sphere about whether affirmative action is good. Nobody sort of questions what affirmative action does. However, as my colleague and collaborator Furuhito Kojima showed, one very popular affirmative action scheme called majority quotas actually can hurt every minority student. So in the context of stable matching, you can build an affirmative action plan that sounds like an affirmative action plan, sort of like looks like affirmative action and quacks like affirmative action, but in fact, systematically hurts all of the minorities. So that's a little scary. And it would be a really sad story if this were my entire talk, right? If I were going to show you examples and some theorem or something about systematically hurting minorities through affirmative action and then stop. I wouldn't really belong here talking about how we can use market design to approach issues of inequality, right? If the answer is market design shows us that you can't, that's sort of really a bad starting place. But this, in fact, is the start of a research literature. So this paper, which circulated for a couple of years and got lots and lots of people thinking, is the first observation that market design really has something deep to say about what's going on in affirmative action. And note, people had written down quota-based mechanisms before. In fact, the original school choice papers, had these sorts of things. Oh, and you can do affirmative action in these ways. But Furuhito was the first person. Furuhito has a number of incredible expertise. One of them is he can just come up with a counterexample to anything. Literally, I have had interactions where, I said, hey, Furuhito, I think this theorem might be true. What do you think? And 25 minutes later, he sends me this email saying, I'm really sorry, I'm teaching in 5 minutes, but I think that, so I don't know whether the counterexample is minimal, but I think the theorem's false. I'm probably wrong. I just wrote this up really quickly. I don't know if it's right, but I want to send it to you. Apologies if it's not correct. But I have to run and teach. I'll look at it again in an hour. And this is in the 25 minutes. I send him the email. 25 minutes later, he has a counterexample for me while he's supposed to be preparing his class, which is really good. Clearly he didn't actually need to prepare his class. Furuhito has sort of smashed the theorem to bits, or the purported theorem to bits. In particular, also, if he can't find a counterexample, the theorem is probably true, even if it may be very difficult to prove. So Furuhito started thinking about, well, what sorts of things go on in these affirmative action processes, and found a counterexample very, very quickly. And it's a pernicious counterexample. So let's generalize the model, and then we're going to look at Furuhito's example. So now every student is going to get a type. So they're going to be a majority, that's capital M, or minority, little m. And there's going to be a new component of the capacity structure. So there's going to be this majority quota. So the rule is a match has to respect capacities and quotas. So this notation here we'll use for the set of majority students. The number of students assigned to the school that are majority students, so intersect these two sets, has to be weakly below the quota on majorities. So I've capped the number of majority students that can show up at the school. Okay? Happy? Sad? We don't know whether we're happy or sad yet. I gave you this really long intro that said this is going to be a bad thing to do. All right. We have to now define stability in the presence of majority quotas. And I apologize. This is one of these slides where you actually need a lot of notation. It looks really complicated, but I promise it's not. It's almost exactly what we had before. So first of all, we're going to impose individual rationality. This is exactly what we had before. Nobody wants to unilaterally walk away from their school. Okay? No dropouts. That's the point of affirmative action. It is unblocked. It's not literally the point of affirmative action. That was supposed to be a joke. Apologies. It is unblocked is going to mean two things. So first of all, the minorities have no justified envy. So we're not doing anything to constrain the number of minorities that can go to the school. So capacity is full, and no justified envy among minorities. Majorities can have justified envy, but only under a very specific circumstance. So you can envy another student if the school's majority quota is met. So exact equality, the number of students assigned to the school who are majorities is actually equal to the quota. So the quota is met. And all of the majorities at the school have higher priority than you. So you can envy a minority student who has lower priority than you, but only when the majority quota is met. Okay? So this is literally the same stability definition, just we sort of shoehorned in this idea that there was a quota on the number of majority students. So some minorities might get in when majority students want to still, but they can't because they're capped. All right. Happy? Almost done with the notation on this round. Stable, always select stable outcomes. So remember, mechanisms are the things that are going to choose the school choice assignment. We call them stable if they select stable outcomes. Good. We say that a mechanism respects the spirit of quota-based affirmative action if, when I decrease the majority quotas, so I make the caps stricter, the outcomes for the minorities improve. This is a very natural definition, right? The point of the plan is to improve the outcomes for the minorities. We imposed majority quotas as a way of doing that, so when I make the quotas tighter. Sorry, yes. Good point. So the outcome for the minority students, or for any student, is going to be your assignment. So mu of I, so let's, what did I use, tilde? So, okay, so mu is going to be the outcome under Q super M sub C. So the vector Q super M sub C. So under the original quotas, you get outcome mu of I, and we'll say I is a minority. That's a little m. We say that I weakly prefers. So R is standardly used for weak preference when P is the strict preference relation. Outcome mu tilde, where this is under this new quota system, Q tilde C super M. All right, so basically, when I compress the majority quotas, I lower those caps, I generate some new set of stable matches. And in particular, the stable match I haven't said anything about stability yet. I generate some new match outcomes under the mechanism. And in particular, the match outcome chosen with the lower quotas has to be better for all the minority students. Cool? Great. So as I previewed, the bad news is that no stable mechanism actually respects the spirit of quota-based affirmative action. Why? Turns out it's actually very simple. You can see it in an example with only 2 schools and 3 students. So let's work our way through these students' preferences, and I'll show you what happens when we lower the caps, and you'll see why this is happening. OK, so there are 2 schools, and there are 2 majority students and 1 minority student. OK, so the minority here likes school 2 more than school 1. The majority students like school 1 more than school 2. And majority 1 doesn't like school 2 at all. So now note, school 1 can take 2. It has a total capacity of 2, and school 2 can take 1. And we have set the quotas equal to the capacity. So these quotas don't bind at the moment. So everybody, this is the old school choice program. I might as well cover up this, and we're running the same mechanisms we had before. So what's the stable match? Well, everybody goes and applies first to their first choice. OK, so the 2 majority guys are at school 1, and the minority is at school 2. Everyone gets their first choice. It's this thing in red. Right? You see that nobody wants to block because everyone has their first choice, and the school's priorities are fixed. We're done. So we should already be realizing that there's nothing we can do by adding affirmative action to this example that can make anybody better off. Right? So all we have to look for is a way to make them worse off. Right? This is already sounding like sort of something's wrong with this model, right? And we're about to see what's wrong with this model. But for now, OK, let's add a majority quota. We'll cap the number of majority students allowed at school 1 at 1. Well, Mr. I1 is still happy, but Mr. I2 gets kicked out, and where does he go? He goes to school 2. Well, now he kicks out the minority student, and he has to go to his second choice, school 1. So that's awkward. So I created a quota on the majority students, and somehow managed to kick out enough majority students that the minorities got kicked out of the schools they wanted to go to. Yes?
But this seems to be coming from the fact that they have different preferences.
Clarify what you mean by that. I think you're onto the right idea.
Well, if the minority student also preferred school 1 to school 2.
Ah, sorry. No, you're right. Different critique, which you're both right about. If, for example, school 1 were just strictly better, there's no heterogeneity, everyone just agrees that school 1 is the best, then these sorts of approaches have more bite, more positive bite. I guess they have bite here too. So the evidence we have, to the extent that we have any on what people's preferences actually are, show that there does seem to be fairly significant heterogeneity. But that's right. And certainly the people who thought of these ideas were thinking, there's a single best school. I want to cap the number of majority students who can go here so we can open up some seats for minorities. So there is something to that. These are not totally terrible policies. But in a second, I'm going to show you something that's more flexible and will still account for that issue. We sort of won't be worse on that dimension, and we'll solve this problem as well. But yes, good, sort of right thought. What's wrong with the model? So one of the things that's wrong with the model is that we've assumed that somehow this weird order, this guy's better than the minority. This guy's position doesn't actually matter here, so we could put I1M anywhere. But the minority guy sort of wants to go to the school the majorities don't want to go to. I don't really believe that. Stuff is strange here. Also note, remember, so we used to be in the optimal allocation. We moved to this thing which is actually Pareto inferior. So after I impose majority quotas, I can create Pareto inferior outcomes. And moreover, so Fujito shows also in this paper that they could cause Pareto improvement. So we don't really know anything about what happens when you impose a quota unless you know a lot more about the structure of the market. They could create outcomes that are Pareto inferior. They could actually Pareto improve even for the majorities. Strange. And it's not just it's not just this mechanism. So there are other types of affirmative action that you can sort of implement directly through moving people up in the priority ranks. If you try and do these things with the top trading cycles, all of these different things fall apart with the majority quotas. Or rather, they don't exactly fall apart, but they become sort of volatile, high variance. Not something you want in a school choice program. Right? So things school administrators hate are year-to-year significant changes in enrollment and allocation of students to schools. Right? It's really bad if it turns out that your program is some years putting all of the underprivileged kids into good schools and some years putting them all into bad schools, especially if it's on election cycles. But OK, so I said this started a literature. So what else is sort of strange about this example? So here's the school C1 where we impose the quota, right? And what we do is we manage to push the minority student into school 1. But he doesn't actually want that seat. Right? We sort of did something which is making it possible for the minority to gain access to a seat he doesn't want. And in the process, we shove out this majority guy, and he comes and kicks out the minority student. But this is sort of strange. If you knew these preferences, if you were, the eye in the sky, and knew the preferences at the beginning, you would never set up this affirmative action program, right? You don't want to create slots. You might try and change the minority's preferences, right? If you think this guy has systematically wrong preferences and should be ranking C1 before C2, you might try and inform him and then implement a system like this. But you don't want to create a system that's going to systematically provide opportunities to acquire goods that you don't want if you can create chain reactions that take away the things you actually do want. Yeah?
So would the solution be something like, instead of having a quota, fiddling around with the priority ranking?
Sort of. So, ish. So there are ways to fiddle around with the priority rankings here, sort of in this same type of framework that don't quite work. But what we're about to do is fiddle around with the priority rankings in a very specific way that solves this problem. So yes, in some sense. So this is the idea that Hoffler-Yen-Mezenil-Theorem had. So having a majority quota decreases the number of majority students that can be assigned to C, even if there are empty seats. And this increases the competition for other schools, right? What happened was we kicked Mr. I2 out, and now he's competing with the minority, where he never was in competition with him before. So the question is, how can we get around that problem? And we move from quota-based mechanisms to minority reserves. So instead of having a quota on the majorities, we're going to reserve seats for the minorities that they're guaranteed access to if they want them. But if they don't want them, they revert back to regular seats. And so this is going to still allow us, if we have perfect correlation in preferences, it's going to have this exact same effect as having had a majority quota. But if there's not perfect correlation in preferences, and for some reason the majorities want to go to some schools and the minorities want to go to others, it's going to guarantee that the majority students are never sort of forced into competition with minorities when they don't have to be. So the number of and the motivation here, remember, is that we don't actually know these preferences ex ante. We might have a strong prior, but we don't know them. So even the most intelligent guesses of quota levels will be prone to small deviations in minority students' realized desires to attend a particular school, and this can cascade inefficiencies throughout the entire system. Excellent use, by the way, of the word cascade in a paper. I'm a real paper technics geek. I like good tech. I like good, diction and like very clear, pointed illustrations of what's going on. This is like one of the things that is amazing about this paper is how incredibly crystal clear everything is as you're reading it. Like, it starts with, so Fujita wrote this paper that shows why these quota-based systems are wrong. There's something weird about the way that they're wrong, and they just tell this story. And it is just, by the time you're done with the introduction, you know everything that's going to be in the paper, and it's all already like internalized in your head. It's great. Anyhow, so these quotas are usually set by third parties, and they can't be readjusted easily, right? So it's not like midway through the mechanism you can change the quota structure. So what you really want is a dynamically adjusting quota system. And the trick for this is going to be I'll put it on the board right now since you guys have been guessing at it. Remember here's our I1m beats, I2m beats I little m, for seat 1. And for seat 2, we had before a minority quota that said just I little m gets in, right? Now, we're going to say, OK, after I little m, in whatever order sort of we had before, include these majority guys. So if I little m doesn't take this seat, it defaults back to a regular seat. And we could add more minorities here, and we get sort of a full reserve system. So this is the old model, the old new model, I guess. We're going to keep the agent types and replace quotas with minority reserves. So every school is going to have a minority reserve, and we're going to require that we respect capacities and reserves. I'm not going to, the explicit technical way to write that down is messy, and the stability definition is messy too. We'll go through that in a second. But hopefully it's clear what this means. You respect reserves if any minority student who wants to take these seats can take them. And you can implement them through the priority structure, but note that we have to implement them by having different priorities at different slots. Everyone see that? You can't sort of set a uniform priority order for everybody. You have to have, if you want to do a uniform ranking, you're going to have a uniform rank, and then this reserve, cap, or lower bound, I guess. But hang on to this idea about the individual slots, because we're going to come back to that in a second and show that, sort of a nice way to think about all of these mechanisms is as mechanisms where the priority structure is disaggregated to the level of the slots. All right. So now, a match is going to be stable. And by the way, when we do that, the stability definition will get easier. Bonus. A match is going to be stable in the presence of reserves if, again, it's individually rational, and again, it's unblocked. So this is even more complicated than it used to look. So first option, you're a minority, and everyone at the school has higher priority than you. So that's normal. Minorities just can't have justified envy. You're a majority. The reserve slots are full, and all of the and everybody there has higher priority than you. Or you're a majority. The reserve slots are not full, and all the majorities there have higher priority than you. Did I flip those? I might have flipped those. Yeah, I flipped those. This knot is supposed to be up there. Sorry. So if the reserve slots are not full, then you're competing against the majorities, and some minorities might take something you want. Yeah, those are flipped. My apologies. If the reserve slots are not full, then there are some slots that are just sort of like normal slots, and so you want to be you can't have justified envy over anybody. Okay? I'm not seeing lots and lots of happy nods. Good. We'll try this again. Just using this example, let's try and define what we mean. So the match is going to be stable if minorities just don't have justified envy, right? They compete for these slots normally. They have a leg up at these slots. So anybody who, if they want to move into this school, it has to be the case that they have lower priority than everybody else. That part's just like we had before. The weird thing's going to happen with the majorities. So for the majorities, if all of these slots, the majority students need to have lower priority. They can't have the majority who wants to move in. We'll call him I capital M number 3. If he tries to move into these slots, it just needs to be the case that everybody there has higher priority, because he can take these normally. They're normal slots. Happy? For these lower slots, either he has to, they have to be held by minorities. So if little I little m is there, then even if he wants this slot, he can't have it. So this guy might have infinitely lower priority than him. Well, not infinitely, there are only finitely many students. Might have significantly lower priority than him, but because he's in a reserve slot, he can have it. If this guy's not here, then this is a normal competition among the majorities. All right, so that's the idea. It's sort of normal stability, no justified envy for the slots that are normal. And then, same rule here unless there are a bunch of minorities taking up all the reserves. Happier? Good. A lot of people who were shaking their heads earlier have started nodding, and people who didn't do anything stayed not doing anything. I hope that's an improvement. All right. So the first, the main theorem and observation discovery of this paper is that minorities reserves work really well. So for any match that's stable under a given set of quotas, there's a match stable under the reserves that you get by converting all the quota slots into reserve slots, like that Pareto improves on the quota match. And moreover, unlike in the case of quotas, minority students never Pareto prefer to not have affirmative action to having minority reserves. So the minority reserves actually are making the minorities weakly better off. That's exciting. And so now we found an affirmative action program that's always guaranteed to Pareto improve for the minorities, whereas before we couldn't say anything. Moreover, you can get the reversal. So they actually do Pareto prefer reserves to having affirmative action with sort of very simple conditions on the preference domain. So here's a place where where they were able to make sort of reasonable statements about the preference domain and actually get meaningful results out of it. And you can do the same thing for top trading cycles. I'm not going to do it on the board, but it's the same set of ideas. So this is a huge, huge improvement over the quota problem, right? So if Fujito introduced this problem and said, wait, these quotas are kind of weird, and Hafele, Yenmez, and Yildirim found that this other strategy, which we don't exactly know, I can't make any sort of empirical claim about exactly how frequently either of these two approaches are used, because I just, nobody's done what's, I guess, effectively a sociology study to survey all the different systems that are using affirmative action to figure out sort of how they've exactly implemented their algorithms. But this is much less common. Sort of not an empirical statement, but in terms of people's understanding and the way they think about things, they think in terms of caps rather than in terms of reserves. So when you go and talk to people and say, no, why don't you do this instead? They sort of say, I don't get it. That doesn't seem like it should help. That said, there are empirical examples of places that have done this at least implicitly, including the city of Chicago. Although for reasons that we'll talk about in a second, it almost doesn't make a difference in Chicago. Yes?
Yeah, just as a clarifying question.
Please.
How the algorithm works.
Yes.
Reserves, is it basically you run SOSM for minorities for reserve seats, and then you run SOSM?
Very good question. Yeah, I have black boxed how you actually find stable outcomes in this problem. That is a very good point. I apologize for doing that. The reason for that is that the third segment of the talk, we will show sort of a unified method for getting all of these that is easier than what's proposed in these papers. But you are correct. Like that is, I have explicitly black boxed that, and the answer is sort of what you just said. Like you're going to run the student optimal stable mechanism with sort of rejections that keep track of which reserves have been filled and so forth. That you're sort of going to, always choose the most appropriate set of students from this set. Sort of choose a bunch of guys to fill these slots and then choose guys to fill these slots, or the other way around. And the order matters. We'll see that in a second too. Yes?
So I understand the theory, but I guess I wonder if there's any evidence or even anecdotally that the problem with the quota system has actually manifested itself in hurting people. Because we sort of talk about saying, well, what after reduce reserve and things, because I don't understand what that would help with. Maybe because there's evidence that
It's true. It's a completely open question. My guess, if I were gambling, I would say that this particular type of, second order effect that you get that drives the problem with quotas actually could show up in data, but I don't think anybody knows. It's a good question. Yes?
I think that in the political discussion about affirmative action,
Mm-hmm.
some of the critique is that it's if you believe that the education is signaling more than you're actually learning something,
Mm-hmm.
then it harms the minority students to have research seats, because then when they hold the diploma, it's less worth because they got in because they had a research seat
Yep.
and not because they were good enough.
Now note, though, that minorities getting in under reserves or quotas in this framework will both have that property.
Exactly.
Brent, though, do you have anything to say about that? Sorry for cold calling you. But you know way more about the signaling aspects of affirmative action than I do.
So what's the question?
The question is, minorities get in because they've been given a leg up. This reduces the quality of their signal to employers from getting the degree. What do we think from theory?
My research just kind of main point is that it's problematic to kind of hold these signals fixed because, for example, your SAT score is not just a reflection of your ability, it's also a reflection of market incentives that affected your labor-leisure trade-off that produced the SAT score. And so, we can't just hold these signals fixed, changing the mechanism. We have to, we have to figure out how the signal's going to change. And when you take that into account, you actually can use affirmative action to produce incentives for increased investments among minority students. I mean, it's kind of like a first price auction with bid preferences.
Okay, so the story there, thank you, by the way. So let's all give Brent a round of applause. I just cold called him and asked him to give a brief research abstract. So the story there, so you're right and he's right. The story is that having these sorts of reserves can devalue the signals. The way they're implemented, though, has effects that change the competition among the minorities as well, and can cause them to gain additional human capital in the process.
Well, they change not only competition among minorities, but also across minorities and non-minorities.
Oh, right, sorry. Yeah, so both among minorities and across minorities and non-minorities. And so it can actually make the minorities better, stronger in the end. But this is a huge research area at the moment. As I said, we have one of the experts on this problem sitting here. So I'm not going to try and expound on it right now, but if you want after the lecture, you can all mob him. Good. All right. More questions? All right. Then we will continue. So, Havelier and Yildirim, another cool feature of this paper is that they wrote a theory paper and then they did some interesting simulations. So I haven't talked very much about sort of the toolbox of market design today. So the one thing that gets lost if you're trying to do case studies is you don't get to do sort of one of these like big, and here are all of the tools in your arsenal, and you can go and use simulations and bazookas and. But one of the things about market design is that we often, for example, we'll see in a second another example of this. We have true preference data, or preference data submitted to strategy-proof mechanisms that we can trust is close to true, at least. And so we can simulate outcomes under alternate strategy-proof mechanisms, because we think we know about what people are going to submit to them. Or, we have sort of an estimate of the size of the market, and we know something about the demand. So we can, simulate it. We can do I/O exercises. We can do pure simulations and try and understand when there's no clear comparative static. We can make up evaluation criteria that say sort of what's the probability of X occurring. So Havelier, and Yildirim show that sort of in large market simulations, the reserves actually do really improve minority welfare, and that you get significant Pareto domination of majority quotas for everybody. So this is getting a little bit to your question. It's not a true empirical example, but it's a simulation in a reasonably sized market where the majority quotas are actually hurting everybody. This, by the way, is part of where my prior that this effect would not go away comes from. So the quota mechanism outcomes, if you just impose a very small cap, it doesn't do very much. If you impose a big one, a lot happens. And that line is very twitchy. Like it's, you can move the quota from 51 to 49, and suddenly the outcome is tremendously different. So there's a high sensitivity to quota size. And this one surprises me a little bit more. In general, the students seem to like top trading cycles more than the student optimal stable mechanism. I don't exactly know why that one's true, but that's an interesting fact to puzzle on. Good. All right. So that's the minority reserve story. And so now I've taken you from Fukuhito's initial paper and sort of first observations on quotas up through this paper. By the way, so the quotas paper is in Games and Economic Behavior. Havelier, and Yildirim is in TE. Theoretical economics. Sorry, this may not be a crowd where I can just use theory journal abbreviations. I don't know if there's any crowd where that works in general because they all have like the same set of letters, TE, ET. Anyhow, and both of these papers were written in the last n years for a very small n. I guess Fukuhito's paper, I think, was first circulated in 2009. There are all sorts of other ways to think about affirmative action, and I'm not, unfortunately, going to be able to cover all of them. Let me tell you about these two, and then slot-specific priorities is going to be most of the rest of the technical discussion for the day. First of all, Fujito Kojima, again, this time with Yuichiro Kamada, looked at a strategy for improving the welfare of rural hospitals in Japan. So a problem with rural hospitals is that people don't like living in rural areas on average. And so rural hospitals never quite manage to fill their capacities. And so then the hospitals aren't as good because they don't have enough doctors. And you have the cyclic problem that people don't move into the rural areas and so forth. So Japan decided, there's a very famous theorem of market design, by the way. So another, one of the first theorems that had really serious market design content, sort of wasn't just theory, but said, here's a problem people are trying to fix and theory tells us you can't, is Al Roth's rural hospitals theorem, where when the medical match was being looked at, they said, well, it'd be nice to think about a way to choose a stable outcome that makes the rural hospitals better off. Is there any stable outcome that puts more doctors in the rural hospitals? Because they're always undersubscribed. And so Al proved in his 1984 Journal of Political Economy paper, not only could you not increase the number of doctors at the rural hospitals by changing the stable outcome, but rural hospital defined as a hospital that doesn't manage to fill its quota of doctors, so it doesn't fill up to capacity, at every stable outcome gets exactly the same set of doctors. So you can't even pick a stable outcome to sort of Pareto improve for the rural hospitals relative to everyone else. They're just stuck. So Japan took matters into its own hands by adding regional quotas. So they implemented a system that would force some people to move into the rural regions in their medical match. And So this is a different type of quota-based policy. It changes the design problem fairly significantly. The solution, again, sort of, because I'm a tech geek, I find really, really entertaining and exciting because it was the first technical application of matching with contracts. But also just sort of as a way of thinking about inequality among areas, this is another thing you should know and have in your sort of background knowledge of market design work, should you be thinking about doing work in this area. Complex constraints. So another type of affirmative action approach that's been tried. In the German college admissions system, they have a little bit of a lottery, if you will. So they have affirmative action for students with high test scores. You have advanced priority if you have a high test score. I really should not have erased that. I apologize. I'll be putting that back up in a second. Sorry. You have higher priority if you have a high test score. But you only get to use this priority in a pre-round, which uses the Boston mechanism. So sort of first, high score students play Boston. So now they have this complicated, discount, how much should I strategize game. Then everyone play deferred acceptance, student optimal stable mechanism. So here, the strategic behavior is clear. Here, you might strategize. And if you don't strategize well, you might lock yourself into a school that's less preferred than one that you could get in this round. Very complicated system. Alex has a theory paper on this, and then he has a paper with 3 other co-authors that does experiments to try and figure out how people actually play in these mechanisms. This is my excuse to tell you about another thing in the Market Designer's Toolkit as well. We do lab experiments. And we don't do these lab experiments which are like ultimatum games. We do lab experiments where we have people play the mechanism, where we've controlled their valuations. And it turns out that there are lots of really serious critiques of lab experiments in economics, for sure. There are lots of really good things about lab experiments, too. Here, in particular, the lab has an unusual benefit that's not relevant in any of these other contexts, which is that everybody you talk to in the policy sphere understands the difference between the lab and reality. You sort of say, OK, so we did this thing. We had them all play this mechanism, and we gave them their values, and they were sitting at computer screens trying to, no deception, trying to win money by getting into their highest ranked schools. And the school administrators say, OK, I get it. So that's what happened when you ran the mechanism. I can extrapolate about whether that's what will happen in my school district. By contrast, school administrators are really unhappy with the idea of extrapolating based on other school districts. So Al, I was not around for that for this, but Al tells these stories about having talked to people in Boston and New York. And when he was talking to the school administrators in Boston, they sort of decided on what they were going to do. And then he went to, in New York, they decided what they were going to do. And then they went to Boston. And and Boston said, well, what do you think is going to work? And they said, well, we've just been doing this in New York, and it seems to be working really well. And Boston said, and you think Boston is anything like New York? You must be kidding. Boston and New York are completely different from each other. And of course, they weren't in any of the dimensions that Al cared about. And in particular, they were both completely the same as a lab experiment that he and his crew then ran. And they both school systems were able to say, aha, I get it. I know exactly how we're different from this lab experiment. That's not complicated at all. That's a very simple problem. So another thing that lies in this toolbox, if you write one of these theory papers on one of these mechanisms that has weird behavior, going to the lab and demonstrating the weird behavior can be a very important step to getting people to actually pay attention to it. It's hard to take a theory paper to a bunch of political officials and say, here, read this. I prove that your mechanism is going to have strange strategic behavior. It's pretty easy to show them graphs and say, look, under this mechanism that you're currently using, all of the minorities are worse off than under this other one. That's the sort of thing politicians sort of tend to understand, at least thus far, the best of my knowledge. All right, so third thing, slot-specific priorities. And this is going to be our sort of third role for this topic. Check the clock quickly. Good, perfect. This is the last sort of technical component of the talk, as I think I've probably said to you 4 times, not to mention showing in that slide. This is current ongoing research. And again, apologies for self-citing. This is current research that I'm involved in a lot of. I'm not doing this for the sake of citing myself, I promise. There are two reasons. One, this is the thing that generalizes these other two topics that we just talked about. And I think this actually, it's a topic I got into since I joined the human capital group. Sort of thinking about affirmative action even more carefully and trying to disentangle the issues between these two classes of mechanisms. But also, because I'm currently working on this, I can tell you sort of a bunch of things, as you ask, about the progression and the idea of space and sort of things that are not anywhere on the slides because they're just bubbling around in my head at the moment. And I could not do that for anyone else's papers. So you should think about this as sort of a miniature research talk and the type of paper you guys could be thinking about writing right now. Literally, I was editing one of these papers this morning before I came here. Well, actually, before I was doing that before I made my slides. That was my, or finished my slides. But this is really what this research frontier looks like today. Footnote is that I'm going to do it in the notation in this paper, because one of the other things that we have realized is that the notation of the original papers is not actually sufficient. So apologies, there's going to be sort of a seismic shift in notation, assuming I decide to put the notation of the model on the board, which I think we just barely will have enough time to do, but we'll see. So to the extent that I should use notation here, it's going to look different, and I'll flag it and remind you. All right, so remember I had this theory, practice, and evaluation. So we talked a lot about theory thus far. Meanwhile, people were actually doing affirmative action. It turns out that the economists were having this nice little theory debate, but school systems in the meantime were doing some affirmative action, and we could learn a little bit about it. And the first thing we're going to do is sort of look at an implemented affirmative action program and figure out whether we like exactly the way they did it. And then we're going to use the evaluation to inform theory. So there's the arrow going in the other direction I promised. So if you get nothing else from this part of the talk, here's the idea. Imagine, if you will, that a school has some slots that are reserved for minorities and some slots that are reserved for women. What do you do with a minority woman? You're giggling, but so what's the issue here? What's complicated? OK, good idea. So option one, let them choose. OK. OK, what's the problem with that? Anybody see a problem? Suppose I'm a minority male. I would like to pay you a large amount of money to declare yourself a woman. Right? If you're going to be either a minority or a woman, and I'm a minority male, I have a lot to gain by having you leave that minority slot open. More generally, this is going to be an issue, right? So if we happen to put the
Not necessarily a bad thing, though. I mean, why not let people bid?
Good. OK. Fair enough. So why don't we have an auction before the whole thing starts about, I'll come to you in a second, unless you're going to critique Brent's idea. Yep.
Not exactly clear what's happening here, but minorities and women is the subset of all the people.
Yes.
So are you saying one gets to go first or something?
We're trying to figure that out. So we have a woman who is a minority, and we have some seats. So there's open, and then there's minority reserved, and there's women reserved.
So the minority and women seats are set. There's not just one kind of seat.
Yes, sorry. It's slots reserved for minorities and slots reserved for women. There are two different types of reserves. And we have here, our minority woman. And we're trying to figure out, do we put her here or do we put her here? We're assuming for now that she's not eligible for the open seats, but that will be relevant later. And yeah, so one thing you could do is have everyone sort of get together and just bid and label each woman independently, either a minority or a woman first. Could be. Right. I could break them into pools, but how do I decide how big the pool should be?
No, that's the whole point. You did.
Right, so before I just sort of had a rule that said I want some number of seats minorities have access to. and I want some number of seats that women have access to.
Yeah, the rule is so far ill-defined, there's an ambiguity.
Right, there's a huge ambiguity in it. And if I could cut them up if only I knew sort of what cut to make. But as soon as I make, minority women reserves, I guess I should move this blob over here. So I have minority women reserve and then women non-minority reserve and men non-woman reserve. That was redundant. Minority man reserves. Now I've had to take a stand on whether I want, how many minority women I want relative to my desire for women relative to my desire for men, which you might not want to take a stand on.
You're not the person who made these two original questions.
No, even if, suppose I'm the school district and I've decided I'm going to do this cut and union operation, I suppose.
No, I mean, you didn't make the first two green ones, though.
No, I did. So I imposed that there were going to be these big circles, these minority and woman reserves. If I now sort of cut them, these are for non-minority women and these are for minority women. These are minority women, these are minority men. I've now taken a stand on sort of the relative frequency of minority women relative to minority men, say, which I didn't have to do before, or it didn't look like I had to do before. Yes?
Yeah, so I guess some of the confusion is based on the fact that you've chosen the number of seats for women and you've chosen the number
Right.
of seats for minorities. So why couldn't you just choose the subset? But my
Mm-hmm.
my suggestion would be to pool the two
Uh-huh.
and then use the way that you prioritize. I mean, the other components of the prioritization to.
What other components of the prioritization?
Well, so basically, I guess if you have 10 minority seats and you have 20 minority people who want to go on those seats, then you have some other priorities that allow you to choose between them.
10 minority seats.
Walking distance or whatever.
But again, so I still don't, so I hear you, but now I've sort of merged these two. What if I get only majority women? I haven't allowed any minorities in now. Right? If I merge these two pools, sort of have a pool that accepts either, gives priority for minorities or priority for women, one of them still has to come first, right? Yep.
Why don't you let people take slots and then decide after you see who's taking? Like, so a bunch of minorities come and take slots, call her women. A bunch of women take slots and call her women.
Great idea. That paper's in preparation. Yeah, so what you guys are all finding is that something you do in your system is implicitly taking a stand on how you make this trade-off. I set up one of these, question one, or line one, line two is true, line two, line one is false questions. In the framework of reserves, of minority reserves, having two different types of reserves, I implicitly make some sort of statement about the order in which I fill the reserved seats. And it might be that I do them in sort of sequence, it might be that I do sort of all the women's slots before all, little m, all the minority slots, or I might go, woman, minority, the slots go in some order. Maybe there's some like a big block of open slots here and then more women, then more minorities. But somehow I'm saying something about the order. I've got it, every time I get a minority woman, I have to at that moment decide whether I'm treating her as a minority or as a woman. And I could do that by fiat beforehand by labeling the women. And I could do it by sort of endogenously opening and closing slots. But I'm making a choice. And that's the big idea. So the thing that was missed, including in the Haferler-Yenmes and Yildirim paper, is that the order is going to matter. So in fact, in Haferler-Yenmes and Yildirim, they this doesn't get mentioned. They just sort of say, okay, and the algorithm that I black boxed is going to fill all, I think, they do reserves before open. So they fill all the reserve slots and all the open slots. But that was just sort of just setting up the model. This is how the model with reserves is defined. They didn't realize that putting all the reserves at the bottom was going to make a difference. So now I'm going to take you into Chicago, where they have minority reserves. At these same elite public high schools we talked about before, there are 15% of slots reserved for each of 4 socioeconomic classes, tiers 4, 3, 2, and 1. So 15% each, yes. So there are 60% of the slots are these reserves. For reasons that I have no idea why, tier 4 is the rich students and tier 1 is the poorest students. So they spent, order of $1 million gridding the entire city at the block, I guess the block group level, I think, into these socioeconomic classes. And then they said, we're going to have sort of equal access affirmative action. Every socioeconomic class is going to get 15% of the slots reserved at each school. But now the priorities vary across the slots, and in fact, there are 5 different types of slots. Right? There are some open slots that just use test scores, and then there are these 4 different types of reserves. And the standard model that I gave you doesn't have multiple types of slots. And so they needed to do something, and what they decided to do was just sort of cut every school into 5 subschools. So they made these bubbles, except instead of women and minorities, there was open, and then 4, 3, 2, and 1. And the fundamental coding assumption, when they were programming this up, they decided open beats all the others. And in fact, then they did 4 beats 3 beats 2 beats 1. Oh, sorry, right, beats I haven't defined. Means we fill, sort of all things being equal, we fill the open seats first. So if someone's eligible for both an open seat and his reserve seat, he takes the open seat, which is now on the board. Sorry, I should not have, I have a picture now, but this is what it really is. So we go through, we sort of try and fill the open seats, then the tier 4, 3, 2, and 1 reserves. Now, let me tell you 2 features of this market that will not surprise you. Yes? Mm-hmm. They are in principle, but this is going to rule that out. So yes, so in practice, these are actually reserves. So we just sort of, all the tier 4 guys get advanced priority for the tier 4 slots. After that, 3s, 2s, and 1s. Right, if they don't fill up, they could have them. So they're running Hoffler-Yen-Meson and Yildirim, but in practice, there is tremendous over-demand. So there's 4-to-1 demand for seats. So all of these are basically just only for the reserve group. Second important fact is that the minorities have systematically low test scores. So what happens here, in general, minorities don't get very many open slots, but they get some. And so it's the lowest scoring minorities who are left to take the reserve slots, the ones who sort of wouldn't get in otherwise, who don't have the opportunity to get access to the open slots. Now, this ordering was sort of a coding decision. It gets a footnote basically in the description, almost. So let's pretend they made the other coding decision. They move all the open slots to the bottom now. Well, what's going to happen? So now the highest scoring minorities take the reserve slots, because it says fill the reserves first if we can. And it's the low scoring minorities that are left to compete for the open slots. And even though we've peeled off some of the high scoring tier 4 guys, the minority scores are just systematically lower. They get very few of them. Now, Chicago didn't know this at the time they implemented this mechanism, but the mechanism is strategy proof modulo that truncation thing we discussed. So we actually can simulate this change. And it's pretty significant. The total changeover is about 18% of the allocation if we move from the system they're currently using to this counterfactual with the open slots at the bottom. And in fact, we can sort of cut this in a bunch of different ways, and what happens is exactly what you'd expect. It's almost, yep.
With that last statement, you mean that the second column,
Yep.
18% of the seats, 18% more of the seats go to minorities?
No. When we move from the current mechanism to the counterfactual, 18% of the seats change hands. I'm about to show you what happens to the distribution. But it is the case that it's almost, and note that this one we expect to be worse for the minorities because it's the low scorers who compete for the open seats. So they're going to lose seats rather than gain them.
Okay, so 82% of the seats would be allocated the same way regardless.
Yep.
But what happens is
Exactly. And so this 18% change, so blue here is current, red is counterfactual. This is an aggregate. You can already see that the tier 1, the worst off minorities lose a bunch of seats. This is actually underrepresenting the effect because they also end up in schools they like less. So they move to schools that are lower on their preference orders. Interestingly, there's a little bit of gain for tier 4. Most of the gain happens for tier 3. We don't have a great empirical explanation for this other than the outside options. So we think the tier 4 guys submit slightly shorter preference lists on average. So it seems like maybe if they're not getting into their top choice schools, they're just going to private school. But very clear is this tier 1 effect. And you can cut it a second way. So now blue is current, red is counterfactual again. Green is going to be their reserved seats. So under the counterfactual, at all but 2 of the schools, they actually just barely manage to get their reserve. They don't get a single open seat at all. So moving the open seats to the bottom, this sort of innocuous coding level, or innocuous looking coding level change can lock the minorities into their reserves, turning these reserves effectively into quotas. A different type of quota from the one we were just discussing, but like, it becomes a rule that says you can only have this many minorities in the school. So this ordering feature that was sort of present in a lot of this previous work, it's present in the work on majority quotas too, but nobody had noticed that it actually impacted the final allocation. It turns out to have really serious welfare impact, at least again in terms of sort of the distributional outcomes. We don't know how to turn this into cardinal welfare. So in this paper, we give a model that sort of looks at this affirmative action problem, also neighborhood priority in Boston, generalizes also cadet branch matching. The story in all of these applications that unifies them is that the priorities vary across the slots. And what we show is that any ordering, so any way I cut the ordering over the seats, so if I do this one or this one or this one, all of these are going to give rise to a generalization of the student optimal stable mechanism. It's called the cumulative offer mechanism that is stable and strategy proof and improvement respecting. So in some formal sense, this ordering parameter, which has welfare impact, is a fully general and fully flexible lever for market design. You can tell the policymakers to set it however they want. And you can do, not in this paper, it's not in this paper and I won't have it on the board, we can talk afterwards, you can do things that are even a little bit more flexible than that sort of endogenously choose the order in which to fill slots under certain circumstances. But that's the fundamental idea. So we're going to open up a new potential lever for market design. In the process, we're going to open up some new market design applications. We'll be able to re-understand Hoffler-Yen-Meson-Yildirim perhaps a little bit more clearly. It turns out that the improvement from quotas to reserves is actually a statement about respective unambiguous improvements. So you can sort of, through this general framework, see even more clearly why those results work. All right, how are we on time? OK. So I think what I'm going to do is, in the interest of making sure we talk about open questions and things at the end, I'm going to show you the informal model, then talk about applications, maybe tell you 1 or 2 entertaining stories, and then we'll wrap. So instead of going into all the technical detail, which you can see in the slides, even more I recommend you read the paper, but wait until we post the new draft in the next couple of days. This is the story. The general framework that encapsulates all of these problems is many-to-one matching with contracts. So now we're going to let agents not only decide whom they match with, but also what the terms of exchange are. So, oh, he's gone. But we can add money if we want. We can add these cadet branch matching, sort of partial money transfers that I'm going to work 3 additional years of service. We could also negotiate hours worked or student loans or who knows what else. Agents are going to have preferences over contracts with branches. And then branches have some number of slots. And every slot is going to be able to hold at most 1 contract and is going to have its own independent priority order. So remember, I had drawn right here, and apologized for erasing, a story. Let's see if I can remember exactly what it was. So it was slot 1, IM1 beats IM2 beats that does not look like a capital M, little m. Slot 2, I little m beats, not going to change colors, I1 cap m beats I2 cap m. So this branch has 2 slots, one of which is a minority reserve slot. And there's a rule that says slots are filled sequentially, and that's called the precedence rule. And I could choose 2 different rules here. I could choose to fill this way, or I could choose to fill this way. And the main results of the paper are going to say that it doesn't matter which one you choose. You just, so long as you name one, you're, whoops, sorry. There we go. So long as you name one, you're going to get a generalization of the student optimal stable mechanism that is stable and strategy proof. And it sort of has other nice footnote properties. We now suddenly find ourselves in this generalized world caring about the order in which the agents propose contracts. Don't worry about that. That's a technical point. Very important for these general applications like cadet branch matching. We also talk about airline seat upgrades in there, by the way. respect for unambiguous improvements in priority. Here, really people might do things to try and change their priority structure. They probably can't change their social type, whatever that is, but they certainly can do things that change their their socioeconomic status as coded by the city of Chicago. And there's a little bit of evidence that people do a little bit of this. So I mentioned that when you do engineering, you can fix the first order issues, and then there are second order or 12th order issues. Something that's maybe like fourth order in the Chicago problem is that people, some very affluent families seem to be buying condos in really, really, really poor neighborhoods so they can claim that their residence is in tier 1 rather than tier 4. This does not seem to be first order by any stretch, but there's even more engineering to do and to think about here. And then there are a bunch of different applications. So one of them, which I'll just do on the board, is actually going to be faster. We're going to be able to reinterpret the minority reserve story. We can say a little bit about uncertainty. I think I'll talk about that one and Chicago and Boston. Sounds like the right allocation of time. So first, really quickly, actually I guess I have the example right here, but let's go back to the other color. So here is majority quotas, right? Now, I'm going to rewrite the majority quotas story as having the majority guys down here. Keep them in their order. The majority guys beat each other, just as they do up here, but they're beaten by the empty set because there's a quota. So agreed, this is, I just basically relabeled the problem. I'm not seeing nods, it's the end of the day. Stretch, happy, wake up. Good morning, good morning. It's great to stay up late. So with majority quotas, we just have this one slot, slot 2, which gives only priority to the minority. We can imagine that that just means the empty set is to the right of the minority. We can imagine that the majority guys are ranked after that empty set. It turns out that an unambiguous improvement in priority for each of these guys is to just move them above the empty set. Sort of, you drag them sequentially. Drag this guy over and then drag this guy over. And now we've improved the priority of both of these majorities without changing their relative priorities anywhere or their relative rank relative to this minority guy. Respect for unambiguous improvements means that these guys' outcomes must have weakly improved. And we can use that fact to show exactly that moving from these majority quotas to minority reserves has to weakly Pareto improve. Because also, we sort of trivially unambiguously improve for these minority guys, sorry, this guy, little I little m, because we haven't done anything at all, and we haven't changed his priority relative to these guys. So unambiguous improvement for him, unambiguous improvement for him, unambiguous improvement for him. We've unambiguously improved for everybody. We must Pareto improve. So now we can rederive sort of the first main theorem of Hoffler-Yen-Mezenil-Theorem as a consequence of this more global result about the structure of the matching mechanism. Happy, that one's good. It's always nice, so again, I'm a bit of a theory geek. I'm a lot of a theory geek. It's always nice when you can sort of re-understand existing ideas that felt like they came from very different spaces through like sort of some more general, broader structure. That often teaches you a bunch of stuff you didn't know. Let's talk a little bit about uncertainty. Test scores are a little bit stochastic. In this model, they're just a little bit stochastic. So with probability 1/2, the minorities score well. With probability 1/2, the minorities score badly. What we're going to think about, so something that comes up when you give talks in this idea and is actually relevant in the practice of these slot-specific priority mechanisms, is the possibility that the school system knows something about its preferences. They come over outcomes. And so, if they don't get the right number of minorities in the school, the next year they might just change the number of reserve slots, right? Sort of, oops, they didn't work. And there's some evidence they do this. Chicago increased the number of reserves because, as they said, they felt like it hadn't had the impact they were looking for. But the order still matters if there's any heterogeneity in the test score distribution across years. Well, why is that? So we're going to imagine that there are 2 minority reserve slots at the top. So little m1, m2, m3, and then down here are 3 majorities. So this is the easy case. With a probability 1/2, the minorities score well, which means they place in here in the score distribution. Nevertheless, the reserves are at the top, so the high-scoring minorities take the reserve slots, leaving the 3 majority guys to take the open slots. In the counterfactual, the minorities score badly. They're in the bottom of the score distribution. We still have the minorities taking the reserve slots and the majorities taking the open slots. Okay? So under either state of the world, this mechanism admits the exact same set of students. In particular, the same number of minorities, which is 2, and there's 0 variance, right? Happy, good. Now suppose the school system, when they got up in the morning and decided how to set up their mechanism, put the reserve slots at the bottom, and has adjusted the number of reserves to target the same expected number of minorities admitted. Well, now it has to adjust the number of reserves downwards, because in the state of the world where the minorities score well, the minorities get some open slots. So little m3 finally gets to go to school. But now in the state of the world where they score badly, there's only 1 reserve slot, so only little m1 gets in. So, reserves at the top, reserves at the bottom, I can fix the expectation, but the variance goes from 0 to 1. So something about the setup, something about this order is telling us more even than we get from sort of just the pure static theory with fixed priorities and preferences and things. It's telling us a little bit about our response to uncertainty. And we don't have good formalizations of this yet. But it's very natural as an idea that if what's happening is sort of the minorities compete for the open seats first, then we're going to be very sensitive to changes in the minority test score distribution. Right? In years when the minorities just have like incredibly good scores, they're going to take lots and lots of open seats. Whereas when the reserves are at the top, they look a little bit more like quotas. We have very low sensitivity because the score distribution has to jump a lot for the minorities to start over-competing in the open seats. So this is a thing that we talk about a little bit in this paper, but really is not, this is not a solved problem. Definitely something that you can think about. And if you're interested in thinking about it, you should come talk to me because I have a little bit more data than I'm showing here about what sorts of things we expect to see. But as I say, this is not a solved problem. Second engineering problem. So transition. That was response to uncertainty. This is an engineering game. What would an intermediate mechanism for Chicago school choice look like? So remember, we had this option with all the open slots at the top. And we also had this option 4, 3, 2, 1 open with all the open slots at the bottom. So a natural thing to try, I even have it right here. This is current. Natural thing to try is to sort of mix them. Have some open slots and then some reserve slots and some open slots and some reserve slots. This idea sort of came up at the beginning. So what do people think is going to happen when we do this? Anybody? Where does it lie? So here's current, here's counterfactual. There's some spectrum between the two of them. Where should I put the line for the intermediate mechanism? Good, everyone thinks it should go in the middle. So did we. It's intermediate with respect to the priority structure. I guess maybe it's kind of rude to call it intermediate and then quiz you on where the line goes. In fact, it is almost the same as the counterfactual. So now here, slightly different, graph convention. Blue is still current, red is still counterfactual, green is now going to be the results of the intermediate mechanism. We were very surprised when we first got this. Like, the first thing I did was check all the code really carefully. The second thing I did was send it to Typhoon, who said, you need to go check the code. What's happening? Why is this going on? Well, it turns out that the minorities in Chicago, the tier 1 minorities, score really badly. And so now, if you start with the open seats, the first open seats go to some majority students, tier 4s. Now the reserves, we peel off all of the highest scoring minorities, and so the next open seats also go to majority students. And then we peel off the highest scoring minorities again. It's basically the same as if we put all the reserves at the top, because every time we look at open seats, all the minorities who are scoring in that region have already been peeled off into reserves. So after we checked the code a bunch of times, we started thinking about the theory, and it actually became completely clear what was going on. Yes?
I was just wondering why policymakers doesn't like variance in the number of minorities. Because
I'm not making a claim about whether they like variance in the number of minorities. I think they don't like high variance. I did make a claim that they don't like high variance in the, just general variance in the allocation of students to schools and demand for schools and things because it affects their planning a lot. But, you know.
But if you go back to the slides or
Mm-hmm.
something, yeah,
Here.
to this one.
Yep.
I mean, why would you want to adjust the number of seats because more minorities got accepted because they had high test scores?
Sorry, good question. To be clear, so I think it sounds like I didn't quite make myself clear. What you're adjusting the number of seats for is to hold the expectation fixed. Right, so a lot of times when they talk about sort of diversity in schools, they're saying something like, I'd like this school to be a third, of the type X and a third of type Y. And so what we do find is that when their policies sort of don't match their idealization of what the outcome should look like, they readjust quotas to try and target that outcome.
But the way I understood affirmative action is not that you want a certain amount of minorities, but you want a certain amount of minorities that wouldn't get in otherwise.
Yeah, so
the target should not be to have, say, a third of black people, but
so that's definitely right. So you might think that the Supreme Court has ruled out reserves at the top and is okay with reserves at the bottom. Right? You might think that this is basically quotas because you're reducing the variance as low as you can make it, and that this is what you actually are talking about when you're doing reserves and affirmative action. I am very I don't think I know enough about the legal structure to make a statement that I believe that statement, but I'm very in favor of that view. Like sort of it sounds to me like this is more the intent, and certainly Chicago, when they set up their system, it was satisfying their general intent, and they raised the size of the reserves because they weren't getting as many minorities in as they wanted. But in some sense, they picked an order. Their current order is closest to their stated policy goal in the sort of natural space that they were spanning. So I'm very sympathetic to that view. Like I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that you should pick this one over this one. Just that the order matters and that you as a policymaker have to pay attention to what it's doing. In a second, like really one slide, I'm going to show you a situation where they picked the sort of wrong order for their stated policy goal. Again, people just didn't know these orders mattered. So now, we're doing socioeconomic affirmative action in Chicago. What about neighborhood priority in Boston? So this problem looks very similar, so similar that I'm just going to highlight the relationships. So instead of the elite public high schools, we're going to talk about K through 12 public schools, because that's where the school choice program is in Boston. They have two types of slots. So there are open slots and walk zone priority slots. And so just like Chicago, they're going to divide the school into sub-schools, in this case 2 of them. But they decided to fill the walk zone sub-schools before the open ones. So whereas Chicago filled open before reserves, Boston is going to fill the reserves before open. And you guys sort of have been hearing me talk about this, so you're probably already starting to guess what's going to happen. So how does Boston break ties? They don't use test scores. They use a uniform lottery number. So in expectation, sort of the lottery looks like a walk zone student, a non-walk zone student, a walk zone student, a non-walk zone student. First thing they do, fill the walk zone seats. Well, what's the residual distribution? These guys in red, all of the high lottery number people who didn't go into the walk zone seats are non-walk zone, right? Because we peeled off all the high lottery number walk zone guys and put them into walk zone seats. So the second stage of the mechanism where they fill the open slots is really just putting in non-walk zone guys. In fact, a very similar mechanism has no walk zone seats at all and just reads people off in order of lottery number. So how similar are these two mechanisms empirically? There's about a 2 to 3% difference. It's almost exactly the same. So they have these walk zone seats that have almost no impact on the allocation. All right, well, why did they have the walk zone seats to begin with? Well, this was an extraordinarily delicate compromise between the neighborhood schooling lobby and the school choice lobby. When they implemented the school choice system, they said, all right, fine. We know that there are all these parents, mostly who've bought into good neighborhoods before there was any talk of school choice. We know there are all of these parents who really, really want to be able to send their kids to their neighborhood schools, and we know there are all these parents who want to be able to send their kids out of neighborhood. So we'll have a grand compromise. Half the seats at every school will give walk zone priority, and half of them will not. So we have sort of a balance, 50-50 between the neighborhood lobby and the school choice lobby. And as they ran this program, they started to notice that sort of the allocation at the really good schools looked like 50-50, or it's maybe 60-40 or something. So it didn't look like they had given much of a leg up to the walk zone students. But they didn't really know why, right? So like this ordering, by the way, was chosen by IT when they implemented the algorithms. The IT guys who like understood the algorithm design questions sort of looked at it and said, oh wait, we got to break a tie here somehow, and so they chose this ordering. But they didn't ask anybody. They certainly didn't go back to the economists who would like help them build the algorithm to begin with and say, you guys left this thing out, what do we do? They just sort of flipped a coin. So meanwhile, there's not very much walk zone assignment going on in Boston, and it reaches a head when Boston Mayor Thomas Menino announces something stands in the way of taking our public school system to the next level. A student assignment process that ships our kids to schools across our city. Boston needs a radically different school assignment process that puts priority attending schools closer to their homes. So the neighborhood lobby got stronger and said, we're not getting these extra seats we were promised, And Menino sort of said, you're right, I don't know why, time to throw away the entire school choice system. He in fact promised that 1 year from that day, this was his State of the City speech 2012, he had promised that at his next State of the City speech, he would have presented a new program that was going to replace the current school choice system. Meanwhile, Typhoon and I were writing our paper about Chicago. This was sort of beginning of 2012, Menino makes this statement. Typhoon and I are learning that this priority order thing matters a lot. And we started talking to Parag, who had the Boston data, and said, well, any chance you can figure out whether this matters in Boston? And Parag said, I'm sure it doesn't matter in Boston. And then he ran in and said, whoa, no. Turns out, and we were stunned too. It actually, the extent to which these mechanisms are exactly the same in Boston was just stunning to us. That this ordering thing has completely subverted the entire walk zone school system, school program. We were able to prove theorems to this effect. In the interest of time, I'm not going to belabor this at all, but so one way to help talk to people in the government is to say, I have a theorem that says, moving the walk zone seats down in the order will weakly increase the amount of neighborhood assignment. Trust me. I know it sounds counterintuitive. Having them at the top sounds like they get to pick first, but that's not what's going on. My colleagues who were based in Boston gave talks in the meetings that were just being held to discuss what should happen to the school choice system. And there were all sorts of debates. People weighed in. MIT tells us so many children in the walk zone high schools flood the pool of applicants that the walk zone priority doesn't really matter. Well, maybe that is true. But if removing the walk zone priority doesn't change anything, why change it at all? People who are pro-school choice lobby would like to have this sort of very non-transparent way of not doing anything for the walk zone parents be there. But luckily, clear heads prevailed. And they made a lot of changes. So there was a very drastic change that was made more generally to the way they define zones. And the External Advisory Committee, which had at first recommended a sort of partial, walk zone, then open, then walk zone order on our suggestion, said, well, if you're changing this whole thing this drastically, don't touch anything else. Leave the walk zone priority for the next debate. But the superintendent overruled the External Advisory Committee and said, after viewing the final MIT and Boston College, that's Parag and Typhoon, it seems it would be unwise to add a second priority. So we're going to get rid of walk zone priority. Why did they do it? Because we have to ensure that if we're going to drastically change the school choice system, it has to be honest and transparent from the very beginning. We can't, sort of have this non-transparent thing that looks like it's favoring the walk zone students that isn't actually. So, it was fun. So this paper, paper with Umut Dur and Typhoon and Parag, when we wrote the first draft, almost by the time it was done, they were moving ahead with this and trying to figure out how to change this mechanism. So, it's one of the very rare instances where I get to have, a newspaper article with or a picture, period, in my slides. So they, got rid of walk zone preference in the end, and that was a result of sort of what we were able to show them through market design. So, we did that full loop. We went, theory, practice, evaluation, and then looped back to theory, and then it led back to practice. Yes? Yes? Such a policy can benefit students who live near a high... I have another very esteemed colleague who once was sitting, we were at the AEA meetings, and he was sitting and reading the New York Times, and he looked up, and there was this gleam in his eye, and he said, every time the New York Times writes an article about something I know about, macrofinance, auction design, like anything, I read it and I think they're completely wrong. I just realized, why do I trust their reporting on everything I don't know anything about? Anyhow, so that's the end of the case study. Really quick wrap. What the heck is market design? It's the application of economic principles and game theory to the design or redesign of market institutions. Hopefully you guys all have some idea of what this means by now, or else I have completely failed. I showed you this slide at the beginning. We've seen all of this. So we've talked about building and rebuilding markets. You even got to see sort of the end product of real work re-engineering Boston. We've talked about working around impossibility results. We started the entire discussion of school choice with Owner Keston's very strong impossibility result that rules out Pareto efficiency, in the presence of strategy, proofness, and stability. And yet you have to do something. School officials want all three of those. They can't have all three. We've worked within existing conditions. This was the why can't we use money? That would make a lot of things easier. But sometimes for reasons of fairness or equality of access, policymakers ban transfers. It's really useful if we can do things that improve efficiency of the marketplace, even in the absence of transfers. And a lot of the literature that I've been thinking about lives in that space. Organizing market function, we've seen how having strategy-proof data, data from a effectively strategy-proof mechanism in Chicago allows us to simulate other effectively strategy-proof mechanisms in Chicago. There's a lot more of this, incidentally. So there's really interesting structural work being done on the Boston data and the Chicago data. You should talk to Parag if you're interested in going in that direction. We saw strategy proofness probably till you guys were all really sick of it. Market thickness, that's this individual rationality thing that we didn't touch very directly but was underpinning everything. We made up all sorts of evaluation criteria, and as I said, there are a couple more hidden in the slides under jumps that I took. And flexibility. The market organizers care a lot about what happens, and so being able to give them a lever like pick whatever order you want, they like those sorts of things. They like to be able to sort of think about and compare a menu. And in fact, so something I didn't say, when we were helping Boston and when we were giving presentations for the External Advisory Committee, what we really gave them, and you can see sort of parts of this in the paper, was a menu of sort of distributions of outcomes. If you set the precedence order this way, the outcome looks like this. So they could sort of feel what all the choices were going to look like, and we said, there's variance, and we can't promise every year it's going to look exactly the same, but at least for the data we have, this is sort of about what you expect to see. And then you hand it to them, and they make whatever decision they feel is right. There was all sorts of complicated politics going on. We didn't get them just changing the precedence order. We got them changing the entire system and getting rid of walk zone priority. But that's, it's good to be able to give them a second best solution when they do something, very, very big and drastic. All right, why do we care? Again, if I haven't convinced you that it can sometimes be difficult to balance efficiency and fairness and incentives, then again, I've probably skipped something you should tell me so I can fix it for next time. How's it related to inequality? So we can reduce frictions, we can help ensure equal access, fine. Okay, where has market design been effective? So this was non-obvious from the talk, or probably non-obvious. Thus far, market designers have spent a lot of time working on self-contained problems. School choice is basically self-contained. The medical match, completely self-contained. It's nice, to be able to be an engineer and not have to interface with a bigger system, like a financial market or something. Very, very nice. But a lot of the future of market design, I believe, personally, and this is all now, from now until the end is going to be opinion, I think is going to come from thinking about applications that interact with these really big, messy systems, like resource allocation on large scales, land, territory. Climate change is a really big one. So climate change, what's it going to do to different countries? How should we share carbon credits and so forth? People are only just starting to take the tools of market design to these questions, and they touch everything, right? It's not even clear what type of counterfactual you're trying to imagine, if you change, China's incentive to produce carbon. But these are really interesting design problems. They're really big, they're really hard, they have tons of moving parts, And so like figuring out the correct ways to carve up these domains and think about them is really, really important. Evaluating existing designs is also actually pretty hard. So first of all, sometimes your data partners disappear. So the San Francisco public school system was doing school choice with Al and a number of his collaborators, and then spontaneously decided to take it in-house. And so we know nothing about how it's working, basically. So figuring out sort of like, this is, you know, even sort of lower level engineering, figuring out how to set up the right partnerships to make sure that we have the data we want to figure out whether these programs matter. And then the methods, you know, there's sort of like all sorts of puzzles about how you should think about evaluating school choice. China, when I was just at this China summer school in socioeconomic inequality, I learned that they have used sort of all sorts of slightly different mechanisms in a bunch of different provinces. Some of the graduate students there conjectured that China was actually basically running randomized experiments. They'd essentially sort of said, like, we don't know which school choice mechanisms are going to make the people happiest and most effectively allocate people according to our goals. So we're just going to like put a bunch of them in different, you know, sub-regions and see what happens. It's kind of hard to run randomized experiments if what you're doing is at the level of an entire marketplace. So figuring out sort of, you know, unless you're China and actually could in principle do that, and I think, you know, they really still can't. There's sort of lots of heterogeneity across these regions that it might be very difficult to control for. Figuring out how to evaluate things like global school choice program changes. You know, sort of the entire city of Boston changes its system. How do we decide whether we improved welfare? These are hard questions. Econometrics need to start paying attention to the mechanisms that people are using, both the ones that market designers have implemented and the ones that nobody actually, you know, built, but just arose endogenously through some sort of negotiated process. There's very recent work on econometric matching theory, but it's all very recent, and it's sort of, a lot of it's at very early stages. Nikhil Agarwal had a job market paper on this last year. Federico Echenique and co-authors have another. Jeremy Fox has been working on this. But sort of understanding how the mechanisms that are being used to determine the equilibrium interact with the underlying econometric questions when we try and do things like estimate preferences. You know, very cool problem, probably something that Brent's, again, more qualified to talk about than I am, but strikes me as a big, big open domain. And then the last one, and this one's sort of really big. I mentioned this with Katerina's paper earlier. Market design has also been siloed, not just has it worked on sort of siloed applications, but to some extent, we haven't, you know, it's such a new field that we haven't figured out exactly how all of our ideas link up with sort of classical economic incentive questions, right? Like, you know, these questions on school competition, you know, they're doing them all inside of a matching theoretic framework. So the thing that really excites me about this new paper that Katerina and her co-authors have written is they have sort of a classic school competition model that they stick a school choice mechanism into, rather than sort of just comparing the mechanisms within sort of the standard matching theoretic world. But so like figuring out how to take the sorts of tools and methods we work with and the implementations and designs and like frame them on the outside with like classic labor and public economics. Very, very important. And finally, I think getting to be feasible. Like, you know, probably 5 years ago, we didn't know enough to even like figure out how to frame the questions. I think we're starting to get there. Last question, of course, very important. Who should practice market design? That's you. QED.